Today's reading is going to be from the book of Revelations. Revelations chapter 2. From Revelations chapter 2 all the way to chapter 3, there is a special message to 7 different groups or 7 different churches. These messages are given to John, the revelator, to pass on the message to these 7 churches. As you read through, there is a pattern that you find throughout all these letters to the churches. The author or the writer is introduced as Jesus himself. And as he writes these letters, he begins by identifying himself. He begins by qualifying himself. He begins by saying who he is. And then it follows with a praise, then a rebuke, then finally with a promise. I want us to look at one of those messages, specifically to the church of Smyrna. You will have to pardon my pronunciation. There are going to be 2 words that I'll find very difficult to pronounce. Some pronounce the word as Smyrna, Sumna. Yeah, but most theologians say Sumna. For whatever reason, I don't know. But I will just say Simna. That's much easier for my tongue. Then our message will be from this letter to the church of Smyrna, that is addressed to the church of Smyrna. I will start by reading from verse 8. Then we'll go through the verses and find out what God has in store for us in this message. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. I remember we once shared a message from the very same portion, focusing on verse 9, which says, I know your afflictions and poverty, yet you are rich. Today, I want us to focus more on verse 10 that says, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. First thing that comes to mind is that there is a guarantee that we are going to suffer. But the Bible says, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. what you are about. This suffering that the Bible is talking about has not yet happened, but it's going to happen. Jesus himself says he knows that you and I are going to suffer. But in that suffering, fear is not an option. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Yes, this message is actually directed to a church. It's actually directed to believers, to Christians who love him and who worship him. And he says to them, you are about to suffer. But fear is not an option. This is a message that we normally don't want to hear as Christians. It's not a comfortable message to hear and accept. But as we go through this verse, I hope we will learn more than just the fear. I have chosen the topic that says, when your fears come true. Normally we prefer the saying, when our dreams come true. And in most cases, if not all cases, they are normally good dreams. They are normally the best that we wish for, that we want to come true. But the Bible today tells us that there's going to come a time when our fears, what we dread, what we are afraid of, will also come true. The things that we fear will also happen in our lives. But fear is not an option. The church that the message is directed to, it's a church in a pagan land. It's a church in a town where there were unbelievers. The message, as we said, is written by Jesus, or is delivered by Jesus himself. If this was a red letter edition, these words were going to be written in red to show that these words are coming directly from the mouth of Jesus himself. These are the words of him who is the first and the last. I want us to also pay attention to the way that he writes, the way these words are put in order. Because we'll find out that these words apply to the church and also apply to the town of Simna. The message, the context of the message, it's mainly Jesus trying to strengthen, to encourage Christians who were under persecution. Everything about the story points out to a persecuted church, to a church that was going through tough times. In this writing, in these verses, there are two things that I also want us to take note. As Jesus is laying out his message, there is some verses that are indicative, that where Jesus declares or proclaims something. There are also verses which are imperative, where Jesus commands something. These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. He qualifies himself as the internal one, the first and the last, the one who died and came to life again. He qualifies himself also as an overcomer. While he's talking to a persecuted church, facing death, he wants them to understand that he who is speaking has overcome the persecution, has overcome death, and is alive. I know your affliction. He declares to the church, I know your afflictions and your poverty. I know the challenges that you are going through. He wants them to understand that as he is talking to them, he is aware of the situation, is aware of the challenges, the tribulations that they are going through. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. We'll come back to that one. Do not be afraid. I know what you are going through. I know your challenges. I know your afflictions. I know your poverty. But do not be afraid. That's an imperative. That's a command. Do not be afraid. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. He qualifies himself. He puts himself in our situation. And he makes sure that we understand that he knows and understands the situation. In this story as well, we also find John, the one who is given this message to pass it on. Jesus already has laid out his CV, and in his CV we find out that he was also made it open that he himself once faced this persecution. They killed him, he died, but rose again. He faced the same persecution, but he overcame. John also, in verse 9 of chapter 1, I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God, the testimony of Jesus. John as well qualifies himself by telling us that he also, as a brother and companion, has suffered this same persecution. Him being at the island of Patmos was because of the persecution that he also suffered. Jesus, who delivers or brings the message, faced the persecution. John, who writes the book, also faced the persecution. So these two people already understand when they are talking of persecution. I want us to first look at the town of Simna. Then we're going to look at the name Simna. Then look at the church. Maybe throw in one of the pastors at the church of Simna and conclude by looking at the suffering or the persecution that they were going through. The town of Simna, the historians say, it was one of the best towns in Asia Minor or in Roman Asia. It was under the Roman kingdom or Roman rule. It was, they say, about 30 to 40 miles from Ephesus. It was a favorite of most of the richest people in that time. The way it was designed, it was the jewel of Asia Minor. town of Simna is found today in the country of Turkey. And they say it actually has got the highest population of Christians in the country of Turkey. I think its modern name is Mir, Izmir. It's still a town up to this day, which makes me so happy to know that these things, some of these things that you find and read about in the Bible, till today you can still go and find the evidence of how truthful our Bible is. Today, Simna is the third largest city in the country of Turkey, saying there's almost 250 around their churches, the Christian churches. This town was once destroyed and lay in ruins for almost 300 years. Now, imagine Jesus talking to the inhabitants of this city, saying, I am the first and the last, the one who was dead and came back to life. He's talking to a city that was dead for 300 years and came back to life. The city was destroyed around 600 BC, and for 300 years it lay in ruins. Jesus is talking about persecution to a town that knows persecution. Around 1402, there was a massacre of Christians in the town of Simna. Around 1424, the Turks moved into the city and killed a lot of Christians. There was also another massacre in 1922. So this city knows and understands what persecution is. And when these words coming from Jesus saying, I am the one who was dead and alive again, came to life, they understand this message. He says, he who, verse 11, from verse 9, verse 10 says, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you a crown of life. The town of Simna was built next to a harbor and Mount Pagas. Mount Pagas had buildings that were designed around it in form of a crown. Those who looked from a distance, it resembled a crown. Jesus says to them, I will give those who are faithful, even to the point of their death, a crown of life. These things that he is talking about are making sense to the inhabitants of Simna. The name Simna, here's another word I find difficult to pronounce. Man. It's not there. It's not in that specific verse. The word man, I don't understand the English. There is an R, there are Y's over there, and an H. But it's pronounced me, Mairi. Whatever suits you. Now, the term simna, the word simna, comes from the word myrrh. Myrrh is a perfume, sweet smelling perfume. This perfume is so special because we find it in many places in the Bible. What interests me more about this perfume, if you read Matthew chapter 2 verse 11, if you also read John chapter 19 verse 39, myrrh was one of the gifts that was brought to celebrate the birth of Jesus. Sweet smelling perfume used to celebrate the birth of Jesus. At the crucifixion of Jesus, whilst he was suffering on the cross, when they gave him vinegar, whilst he was facing persecution, we find that in the drink that they gave him, there was also myrrh. This same perfume, this same sweet smelling perfume, used to celebrate the birth, it's also used in the time of persecution. After his death, early morning, when they are preparing the spices to anoint his body, myrrh is also found there. This perfume, they say, it's a resin from a tree. And for you to extract it, you have to scratch or to cut, to hurt the tree so that it can bleed. Once you have gathered it, for it to release its smell, you have to crush it so that it can release its sweet smell. What a perfect perfume to be used in this time of persecution the Church of Smyrna was facing. You know, coming from an African background, we all know cabbage. Cabbage. Now, as an African, if you find cabbage in big pots, how they would have cooked it, from the way that they would have cooked the cabbage, an African will tell you that this is either for a funeral or for a celebration. Because in funerals, it's a relish, it's the cheapest relish that you can find. But when there is a celebration, it's the salad. It's the nicest stuff. Jesus is talking to a congregation or a group of people that he wants them to be more like myrrh, like Smyrna, the perfume, than like cabbage. Because cabbage in the African culture conforms to the situation. If it's tough times, then they just boil it and give you to eat. But when it's celebrating times, they make the best salads you can have. But this myrrh, this perfume, in times of birth, it's sweet smelling. In the persecution of Jesus on the cross, it is still sweet smelling. Even in death, it's sweet smelling. The message that is bringing out, he wants these Christians, their faith to be like Smyrna, to be always sweet smelling no matter the times they are going through. Whether times are good, they have to be sweet smelling. Whether times are bad, they have to be sweet smelling. Whether they are in the face of death, they have to be sweet smelling. The church in Smyrna, there was 3 groups in Smyrna. The first were the pagans. Smyrna being run or controlled by the Romans. The Romans had placed their bodies in the town. The Romans also believed in emperor worship. The empire was regarded as God, which means worshipping the empire was regarded as a patriotic duty. As a citizen of that town, you were supposed to worship the empire, and that was a must. Some of the inhabitants of the city had come together and donated money to build temples in honor of their rulers. And all the people were required in certain times of the year to come and worship the empire and say Caesar is Lord. Those who did that were given certificates and honored in public. And these certificates that they received, they used them in marketplaces, in places of business. Which means for you to trade, to be in business, you had to have this certificate, which left the Christians in a tight corner. There was also another group, the Jews. One has to wonder why Jesus specifically says, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and they are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This is the first time I hear a synagogue of Satan being mentioned. The Jews had made a deal with the Roman rulers. And the Romans recognized the Jews and their ways of worship. In this agreement, only the Jews were the ones that were allowed to practice their way of worship without honoring Caesar. Now we have this other group, the third group, the Christians. The Christians, their Jesus was not recognized by the Roman Empire, which means the rulers expected from them to come and worship Caesar and declare that Caesar was Lord. The Jews on the other side, they didn't recognize Jesus as well, which means they viewed the Christians as enemies. In this situation, as a Christian, you had nowhere to go. You had nowhere to run. If you went into the synagogue with your Jesus, the Jews would kill you. And if you ran away from the Jews, the pagan worshippers would be waiting for you outside. It's either we kill you or you declare Caesar is Lord. Then Jesus says to this group of people who are suffering such persecution, I know your afflictions. I know your challenges. I know the Jews want to kill you. I know the Romans also are pursuing you. But in midst of all this persecution, do not be afraid. In the face of all this danger, do not be afraid. These Christians, verse 2 says, I know your afflictions and your poverty. These Christians, because they didn't honor Caesar, they didn't have the certificates to trade or to be in business, which contributed to their poverty. They were not allowed to buy or sell freely because they were followers of Christ. This church was poor in material things, was poor. We talked about this poverty. This is the lack of everything. It's not that they lacked luxury. They lacked the needs that they needed to survive. Out of all these 7 churches that Jesus writes to, the church at Smyrna and the church at Philadelphia are the only 2 churches that Jesus doesn't rebuke. He has nothing bad to talk about these churches. It's only praises and promises. I know your poverty. They were really poor. But in that poverty, he says to them, do not be afraid. Fear is not an option. The funny thing about fear is that fear and faith doesn't see each other eye to eye. Once you invite fear in, faith finds its way out. But with faith, you have nothing to fear. As the church of Smyrna is facing persecution, they are poor, they are being chased and being killed. They don't, all the means that they can use to survive are being blocked here and there. One would think that this message makes things better, but things turn from better to worse. One of the pastors, Polycarp, a well-known pastor or leader, elder at the church of Smyrna, who historians say he knew John, who wrote the Bible, who wrote the book of Revelations. Polycarp is going about his business, preaching, taking care of this church at Smyrna that is facing persecution. And the Jews from the synagogue of Satan and the Romans come together and decide this man as a pastor, as a leader, is contributing to popularizing this man Jesus. Let's deal with him to fix this church at Smyrna. At the age of 86, in around 155 AD, Polycarp is arrested. The funny thing about Polycarp being arrested is that even some of the Roman soldiers that arrested him kind of liked him. Because on the way to court, they give him some tips on how to survive. Polycarp, our elder, we know you love your Jesus. But if you get there at court, they want you to make an offering, to burn some incense, and proclaim Caesar is Lord. You don't have to take much of the incense. Even if you take a little bit, instead of shouting the way you preach, even if you whisper that Caesar is Lord, we will stand on your side and make sure you are saved. The old man is quiet all the way to court. When he gets to court, his case is discussed, is deliberated on, and when it is time to speak, he stands up and says, for 86 years, I have served Christ, and he has never done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme the Lord that has saved me? Both the Jews and the Romans are angry. Take him outside to burn him in front of everyone. As they are tying him up, historians say, he says to them, don't waste your time and ropes by tying me to the pole before you burn me. I won't even bother to move or to run. Because he knew his Jesus is faithful, and he understood the promise that do not be afraid. And he was not afraid. And Polycarp died, burnt alive, happy, without fear, because he held on to the promise. Do not be afraid. I know the afflictions, I know your suffering, I know the persecution that you are about to suffer. I love words. The word that is used, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. It's more than suffering. The word used for the term suffer, it's a word that was used to describe a certain type of torture that was being used. Thalepsis was a torture whereby someone who would be tied down on the ground on a flat surface, and they would put weights on your chest. They would put heavy stuff on your chest, slowly increasing the weight until you get crushed to the point that you can't breathe anymore and die. And Christ says, I know that kind of weight that they are putting on your chest. I know that kind of suffering that is suffocating you. I know that kind of weight that might kill you. And in that persecution, in that suffering, don't be afraid. As Christians, as worshippers of Christ, we are guaranteed that tough times will come. One of the men that also went through his own afflictions, his own challenges, is the man Job. Job chapter 3 verse 25 says, what I feared most is come upon me, What I dreaded has happened to me. Job says, the things that I feared most in my life, the dreams that I didn't want to come true are coming true. The things that I didn't want to face in life, I am facing them. The things that I hoped that I will never go through in my life, I am face to face with my worst dreams. Job says, finally, what I dreaded, finally what I feared, finally what I didn't want to experience, I am experiencing. The man was going through the toughest times of his life. After his ox and his donkey have been taken by the Sabians, after his sheep was struck by lightning, after his camels were taken by the Chaldeans, after his sons and daughters were killed by the winds, he says, my greatest fears are being realized. Job was going through the toughest time of his life. After losing everything that he had, he struck with sores from head to toe. The Bible says with painful sores. And now his hope only was his wife and his friends. While he was still trusting or hoping that his wife would stand by his side, the wife says, no, Job, not this time. Are you still faithful to your God? Curse him and die. Job has lost everything. He has lost even the support of his wife. Now his only support is from his friends who take a visit to come and see him. And who, after 7 days of just looking at him, his friends say, no, Job, this is too much. What did you do? Job says, what I have dreaded, what I have feared, what I didn't want to go through, what I hoped I would not face in my life, I am facing it. But he understands that his God said, do not fear. Because we find him in chapter 29 saying, I know my Redeemer lives. Ladies and gentlemen, we worship Christ. We love Christ. There are things that we fear. There are things that we don't want to face. There are realities that we don't want to talk about. But that greatest fear can happen to you anytime, any moment. That job that you love so much, the one that when you wake up in the morning you say, if I lose this job, I don't know what I'm going to do. How will I survive? That greatest fear can come true. Our loved ones that we love so much, that we can't imagine life without them. That greatest fear can come true. The poverty that we fear, the challenges that we don't want to face, the things that we dread,